everybody, I'm Danny Grossman, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, the chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Professor Dershowitz, the recent massacre at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue is not only considered to be the bloodiest anti-Semitic attack on American soil, but an earthquake that is still producing aftershocks both in Israel and for Jews all over the world. To help us understand, we are very pleased to have Arsen Ostrovsky as your guest in our studio. Arsen is the executive director of the Israeli Jewish Congress and an international human rights lawyer. He's a noted expert on anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he was recently awarded the prestigious Nefesh V'Nefesh Bonei Tzion award in recognition for his outstanding Israel advocacy. Well, Arsen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Danny.
Okay. So let's get started. As you know, the world gravitated to the scene of the tragedy. President Trump arrived to offer his comfort to the families, as did Israel's Minister for the Diaspora Affairs, Naftali Bennett. People flew in specially to pay their respects and show their support for the community. One of your rabbis, Rabbi Bill Hamilton of Brookline, Massachusetts, flew in to console the many who sought to make sense of the senseless. One of the young ladies who we met there movingly expressed her sorrow and had a question for you, Professor Dershowitz, so let's hear.
Alan, I just buried one of the victims of the mass shooting in Pittsburgh. And I just want to know, is this a sign of a new wave of anti-Semitism?
I think that it's a manifestation of the oldest forms of anti-Semitism. Look, anti-Semitism has many forms. When I was growing up, it meant I couldn't get a job in law firms, I couldn't get into certain colleges, live in certain neighborhoods. That's all over. It also meant that some Christian churches preached anti-Semitism from the pulpit. That's generally over. What we have today are multiple forms of anti-Semitism. We still have the extreme hard right anti-Semitism, nationalist anti-Semitism, fascist anti-Semitism of the kind manifested by this killer. We also have hard left anti-Semitism on university campuses, as reflected by the candidacy of Jeremy Corbyn. We have Farrakhan-type anti-Semitism who appeals to extremists in the African-American community and tries to persuade them that all their problems are caused by Jews. And finally, the most lethal form of anti-Semitism, far more lethal than what we saw in Pittsburgh, is, of course, Islamic anti-Semitism, which has caused thousands and thousands of Jewish deaths in Israel, in Europe, and in the United States. And the disturbing thing is that the hard left only focuses on the anti-Semitism of the hard right. They ignore Farrakhan. In fact, some of them embrace Farrakhan. They ignore Islamic anti-Semitism. The last thing they would ever want is to blame imams for the terrorism that occurs, and many of them, like Senator Sanders, supports Jeremy Corbyn. So it's an extreme double standard and extraordinary hypocrisy to hear the hard left blame Pittsburgh on the Republican Party, on Donald Trump, without pointing a finger of responsibility at other causes of anti-Semitism that create the atmosphere which allows Jews to be dehumanized.
Arsen?
Professor Dershowitz, it's a great privilege to be on the show with you, and as I think as everyone here in Israel, of course, we certainly grieve with our brothers and sisters in Pittsburgh and the American Jewish community. But I wanted to ask, from my perspective here as an Israeli, trying to make sense of the reaction in America, not just from the Jewish community, from the broader American society to this incredible tragedy. And, what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, it's this incredibly, I suppose, toxic discourse where some are blaming President Trump, others are calling for him not to come to the scene of the crime. We're seeing certain reports in the media and sort of reactions from some within the community from both sides, and in some respects from across the political aisle, trying to blame each other. So I'm just trying to wonder, if, how do we make sense of this? How does the American community move on? How do they heal from this?
Well, first of all, you can't make sense out of the senseless. This guy would have done what he did without regard to who was the president. In fact, in his tweets, he hates Donald Trump. He opposes Donald Trump. He thinks Donald Trump is too pro-Jewish and has too many Jews surrounding him. He probably would have attacked Donald Trump if he had the opportunity to do so. And yet, those who blame Donald Trump for everything, of course, blame him for this too. There was even one commentator who said this was caused by moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. You get the most absurd causal relationships on both sides of the political spectrum. You hear it from the hard left, you hear it from the hard right. We live in an age where rational, calibrated discourse has become virtually impossible. When I defend the right of Donald Trump not to be impeached because the constitutional criteria for impeachment haven't been met, I'm demonized by people on the hard left who think I'm supporting Trump's policies toward immigration, which I strongly oppose. Nuance has left the room, and you have to pick sides, like you do in the Israel-Arab conflict, like you do in other areas of life, and it's very, very hard to have discourse. By the way, the same thing is true on college campuses today when it comes to Israel. You cannot have rational discourse relating to Israel on most college campuses. Either you're 100% anti-Israel, Israel's apartheid, genocide, etc., or you tend to be 100% pro-Israel without being willing to criticize it when it makes mistakes or overreacts. Having a kind of conversation which, in a nuanced way, calibrates problems on both sides has become very difficult. And I think what happened in Pittsburgh represents that. Had the same event occurred in Pittsburgh, tragically, during the Obama administration, the reaction would have been entirely different.
Perhaps you might want to talk about what's going on in Israel and Israel's reaction?
Sure. I mean, I think you touched on a good point there, Danny, as well. You know, there's a Talmudic saying, you know, Kol Israel Aravim Ze Lezeh, which basically means that all Jews are responsible for one another. And certainly here, Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people. Certainly in the wake of this horrific tragedy, there's been an enormous outpouring of support and unity and grieving along with our fellow Jews in Pittsburgh and the United States. We saw immediately the same night Naftali Bennett, the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, fly to Pittsburgh. Bushi Herzog, the head of the Jewish Agency, has gone there. But at the same time, you know, we've also seen over the last number of years some increasing tensions between the American Jewish community and the State of Israel. And we saw just the other day, for example, Minister Michael Oren write an op-ed in the New York Times that in response to the Pittsburgh massacre, one of the things that the State of Israel should do is immediately recognize the conservative and reform movements. So I'm just curious, from perhaps from your point of view, what in your mind are some of the steps that the State of Israel, as the nation state of the Jewish people, ought to do in response to a tragedy like this?
Well, I think we see extremists on both sides. We see the radical left, who doesn't want the President of the United States to perform his duty of consoler-in-chief. If the President hadn't gone to Pittsburgh, he would have been condemned for that. The vast majority of American Jews wanted the President to go to Pittsburgh, but a small number of people falsely claiming to be Jewish leaders opposed his coming because they opposed him. And then on the other side, we see these absolutely bigoted rabbis in Israel who refuse to even recognize that the murders took place in a synagogue because it was a conservative synagogue. How dare they tell us American Jews how to pray, where to pray, and deny that the events occurred in a synagogue, which represents the vast mainstream of American Jews. And so, you know, everybody tries to use a tragedy like this to serve their own political purposes and their own ideological purposes. And when a tragedy like this occurs, we would all gather around and show support. But the Jewish community is so deeply divided in the United States, as it is in Israel, that it's very, very hard to follow the Talmudic notion of Jews being responsible each for the other.
Well, I think you said that very beautifully, Alan. And of course, just recently we had Natan Sharansky talking about the different expectations that Israelis have of American Jews and that Americans have of Israeli Jews, and how difficult it is to get this dialogue going. And you mentioned, of course, Bougie Herzog as well, who flew off to America on the weekend following the funerals. And Bougie just hosted the General Assembly here in Israel, which the theme was, let's talk, between Americans and Israelis, because we are one people. So, Arsen, can you expand a little bit more about what you might expect in the future and what directions we should be taking, as far as in your point of view?
We need more dialogue, not monologue. And what what I've been seeing a lot in the last number of years is essentially each side has been talking over the other. And we need to be talking to each other. The Jewish community in North America, in the diaspora for that matter, and the State of Israel need to be talking to each other, because at the end of the day, we're one people, one family. We have a vested joint future. I certainly think the State of Israel can do more to reach out to Jews from other denominations, from not just from the Orthodox, but from the conservative, from the Reform movements as well. We need to have closer dialogue on issues like the cartel, like the conversion. They need to have, I think, a much greater say in the internal discussions, because at the end of the day, if we as Israel, as the nation state of the Jewish people, we need to also be more accommodating to the Jewish people. But likewise, there also needs to be a certain level of more perhaps of respect and understanding from Jewish communities in the diaspora. I think that we, at the end of the day, we are also a sovereign state at the end of the day. But ultimately, any wounds that need to be healed and any way we can progress and strengthen this bond, it needs to be by way of dialogue and talking to each other, not at each other.
And you would think that a tragedy like this, although obviously it doesn't compare to the great tragedies that Jews suffered, would bring us together. But today, tragedy divides us more than unites us. We are not one people. I have nothing in common with Jewish Voice for Peace. I am much closer to Christian Zionists than I am to a phony organization like Jewish Voice for Peace, which opposes Israel, opposes Jewish values. I don't identify with the chief rabbinate in Israel. They don't speak for me. And we are a divided community. But one would hope that when tragedy like this strikes, and it strikes in a nonpartisan way, among the people killed with Trump supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, you would hope that a tragedy, at least temporarily, would unite us. But it doesn't. We're so deeply divided that there is nothing at this point that unites us. And even a tragedy like this exacerbates the divisions among us.
Well, Alan, we were also honored to get a video question from Lou Weiss, one of the pillars of the Pittsburgh Jewish community and a leading member of the Tree of Life Synagogue. Lou humbly describes himself as a carpet salesman, but his article, which appeared the day after in the Wall Street Journal, beautifully expresses the sheer evil which embodied the attack. He compares the attacker to Amalek, the nation from which time immemorial has been waging war on the weakest and most vulnerable people. Lou noted that several of the victims, whom he knew for decades, were special needs individuals. But despite their handicaps, they were always the first ones to arrive in the synagogue for minyan. And Lou ended his piece by contrasting the story of Sodom, where God sought 10 innocent people to save the city, with the tragic loss of 11 pure souls murdered in Squirrel Hill. So let's take a look at his question.
Hello, Alan. My name is Lou Weiss, and I'm sending this question in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we've had kind of a tough week here. Death penalty question. Here's a guy that murdered 11 innocent people at synagogue. I know you're not a death penalty advocate. How do we deal with this? Should he have a lifetime in prison where he can live and eat and watch movies and watch TV and read books? Or, you know, should he have the ultimate punishment? What do you think?
Well, first of all, Mr. Weiss, thank you so much for your brilliant, brilliant op-ed. As you may know, I know your two brilliant, brilliant daughters, one of whom writes for the New York Times, the other of whom writes for the New York Post. They contribute greatly to intelligence, and support for the Jewish community. So you ought to be shepping a lot of nachas and getting a lot of pride from your two absolutely wonderful daughters. Look, I'm a lifelong opponent of the death penalty. I opposed the death penalty for Eichmann. I opposed the death penalty for the Rosenbergs when I was 13 or 14 years old. I also think that if we were to try to impose the death penalty on this horrible murderer, he would become a martyr for extremists, and they would circulate around him, and the ACLU would have to defend him because they defend people charged with the death penalty. I think it's so much better if he were to be sentenced to live out his life obscurely in a prison. And of course, prisons are not places where you just read books. Just ask Whitey Bulger, who recently was murdered in prison by fellow inmates because he had cooperated. And I do think that when you get somebody like this, it's far, far better to use him to learn whatever we can about the sources of his hatred and let him live in obscurity rather than die as a hero. So that's my view on the death penalty. I understand that other people disagree, and in the passion of the moment, you know, everybody was hoping that maybe he'd be shot and killed in the process. He's one of the rare people who survives a massacre like this. Generally, they either take their own lives or they're shot. I think that we will have a trial. We will learn about him. He will not be treated as a martyr, and he will never, ever see the light of day again if he's found guilty.
But there's just something which came to mind when I spoke to Lou when he sent in the question. As I said, Lou, you know, you're talking about the death penalty, and your beautiful, very moving op-ed talked about comparing the killer to Amalek. And actually, Amalek is where we find God offering, or God entreating the Jewish people to wipe out these horrible people who do such evil things. And of course, this famous story with King Saul having his kingdom rent from him by the prophet. So before we close, let's change gears to a story that has caught the attention of America. And Alan, of course, you just mentioned it. The infamous mafia kingpin, Whitey Bulger, was recently murdered in a brutal attack after being transferred between federal prisons. His life story gained worldwide attention when legendary filmmaker Martin Scorsese fictionalized his character in the Oscar-winning movie The Departed. Professor, we know that you've written novels like Just Revenge, and that you often use popular books and movies to trigger legal and moral discussions as part of your teaching curriculum. So let's hear from a local Bostonian who perhaps speaks in a lighthearted manner, but about a very serious question. So let's roll the VTR.
Hey Alan, as a wicked smart Harvard law professor, how would you answer those who say Whitey Bulger got the just ending he deserved? Kind of like Jack Nicholson did in The Departed.
You will not ever know the identity of undercover people.
You have anyone in with Costello presently?
Maybe.
Do you know who I am?
Maybe not.
I'm gonna have my associates search you.
That was quick. You think he's dead already?
Get your hands off me! I think we could work something out. We are all convinced that Costello has at least one mole inside the Special Investigations Unit.
Well, whatever. I know you'll agree that the Sox got the justice they deserved.
Well, I think he certainly deserved what he got, but I think the person who hasn't gotten what he deserved yet is his brother, William Bulger, Billy Bulger, without whom Whitey Bulger could not have so successfully operated. William Bulger was the one who was very close to FBI agents. He got them jobs. And the corruption of the FBI through people like John Connolly, who now is serving a prison term, and others who corrupted the FBI and tipped off Whitey Bulger to who he had to murder and when he had to escape. I think those people haven't fully gotten what they deserve. And it's so interesting because Billy Bulger is honored. You know, he was president of the University of Massachusetts, president of the Senate, and yet he played a very, very central role in the rise and protection of his brother Whitey Bulger. So we never get complete justice. You know, here we have street justice, but you know, he escaped so long. The many, many years that he lived openly in Santa Monica, where the FBI could, I think, easily have found him, but they didn't want to find him because he had a lot on the FBI I think the FBI bears some responsibility for how many years Whitey Bulger managed to live in freedom with his girlfriend, and also how many years he lived as a mobster, killing people because he was warned by the FBI, by FBI agents, by corrupted FBI agents, when he had to flee and where he had to go and who he had to kill. So, you know, justice for one person is not justice for all of his facilitators.
Okay, and Alan, you just mentioned the Sox as well.
Well, you know, the Red Sox did me proud. They did. Look, they won from the last half of the batting order. They won with their bullpen. They didn't win with their stars, and that shows a great team. When, you know, Mookie and DJ were not performing, you saw people at the other end of the batting order, people like Pearson, people like Price coming forward. So it was a great day for Boston, for my friends who own the Red Sox, and, you know, for baseball. So I was thrilled. I was there. I was at the first game of the World Series. I would have been at game 6 and 7, but we didn't have to play 6 and 7. I was in the locker room. The only time the Red Sox won the World Series at home in 2014, I was in the locker room with Big Papi pouring champagne on my head. I didn't wash my hair for 3 days. And so, as you can see, I'm a major Red Sox fan. I was also a Dodger fan. This is my Brooklyn Dodger World Series ring from 1955, the only year the Brooklyn Dodgers ever won the World Series. But I did not become a Los Angeles Dodger fan. I remained loyal to the Brooklyn Dodgers and then the Boston Red Sox.
Well, it must have been a tough series for you, the Dodgers against the Red Sox, but at least I'm happy that you're happy. So that's, I guess, all the time we have for today. And thank you for your time, Professor Dershowitz. And I would also like to thank our guest, Arsen Ostrovsky. And if you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you.
Thanks.